Hello and welcome. My name is Kim Daniels, and I'm the director of the Initiative on Catholic Social Thought and Public Life at Georgetown University. We're so grateful that so many of you are joining us today for this conversation. We have almost 2,000 of you signed up for this online dialogue, and I know many more will view it in the months and weeks ahead. And we're having this conversation, of course, at an extraordinary moment. Yesterday, President Donald Trump delivered an unprecedented attack on Pope Leo XIV, calling him weak and terrible on foreign policy, claiming that he needs to get his act together and that he's hurting the Catholic Church. President Trump followed this by posting an image of himself as a Christ-like figure. Pope Leo responded this morning on the plane to Algeria for the beginning of a 10-day trip to Africa, saying, "Too many people are suffering today, and I believe someone must stand up and say there is a better way." He said, "I have no fear of the Trump administration or speaking out loudly of the message of the gospel, which is what I believe I am here to do, what the church is here to do," Pope Leo said. So let me begin with what should be beyond dispute. This is an appalling attack on the Holy Father. It's an attempt to undermine his moral authority, to silence his pleas for peace and for the Church's diplomatic efforts. And it should alarm not just Catholics, but anyone who cares about religious freedom and all people of goodwill as well. This extraordinary exchange between the Pope and the President comes in the wake of the US and Israel's sustained air campaign against Iran begun a month and a half ago, in the latest iteration of what Pope Leo has called a zeal for war spreading throughout the world. Iran is a country with a long history of supporting terrorism across the region, and for years its nuclear ambitions have rightfully been a source of international alarm. Those realities are part of the context for our conversation tonight. But the conduct of this war raises profound moral questions that can't be answered simply by pointing to the threat that Iran poses. An estimated 1,400 Iranian civilians have been killed in the first month of operations. A U.S. airstrike destroyed a primary school in Manab, killing at least 175 people, including many, many children. And the administration has threatened to bomb power plants and water infrastructure. Secretary of Defense Hegseth has said that the U.S. does not fight with what he calls stupid rules of engagement. And President Trump himself has said, "I don't need international law." For centuries, Catholic teaching on war and peace, rooted in the just war tradition and broadened under Pope Francis toward an expanded vision of active peacemaking, has insisted that how a nation decides to go to war, how it conducts war, and how it works for peace are all moral questions, not just political or strategic, but moral questions grounded in the dignity of every human life and the demands of the common good. And Pope Leo, of course, has been a persistent voice for peace throughout this war, his words growing more urgent with each passing week. On Easter Sunday, he said, "Let those who have weapons lay them down. Let those who have the power to unleash war choose peace, not a peace imposed by force, but through dialogue." He's also said, responding to the president's threat to destroy Iran's civilization, simply and clearly that this is not acceptable. It is truly unacceptable, he said. And he said, "True strength is shown in serving life." U.S. Catholic leaders across the spectrum have also been strong. And today we're going to take up the same question Pope Leo has been asking of the world. What does it mean to choose peace? What does Catholic teaching actually ask of us today, of our leaders and of our country? So to explore these questions, we've brought together four remarkable leaders who bring to this conversation the perspectives of Catholic social teaching, international law, literature, and the lived experience of combat, and on-the-ground journalism from the region itself. Sohrab Ahmari is the U.S. editor of Unheard and a former columnist for The New Statesman and The Wall Street Journal. He writes regularly about Iran. His books include Tyranny, Inc., How Private Power Crushed American Liberty and What to Do About It, The Unbroken Thread, Discovering the Wisdom of Tradition in an Age of Chaos, and his memoir, From Fire by Water, chronicles his conversion to Catholicism and has just been re-released. Phil Cly is an award-winning author and veteran of the United States Marine Corps. His recent article in the New York Times raises questions about the justification for the U.S. war in Iran. He is the author of Uncertain Ground, Citizenship in an Age of Endless, Invisible War, Missionaries, and Redeployment. Mary Ellen O'Connell is the Robert and Marion Short Professor of Law and Professor of International Peace Studies at the Kroc Institute at the University of Notre Dame. Her work is in the areas of international law on the use of force, international dispute resolution, and international legal theory. She's the author of The Art of Law in the International Community and co-author of Self-Defense Against Non-State Actors. And Elisabetta Piqué is a war correspondent and Vatican reporter for La Nación, Argentina's main newspaper. In February, she reported from Israel and Lebanon at the start of the U.S. war in Iran. She's reported on wars and conflicts in Afghanistan, Iraq, Kosovo, and throughout the Middle East, and has traveled with both Pope Francis and Pope Leo to Lebanon and other countries in conflict. She's the co-author of The Election of Pope Leo XIV, The Last Surprise of Pope Francis, the author of the biography of Pope Francis, Life and Revolution. So throughout this dialogue, we'll be taking questions from you, from the audience, and we'll ask those towards the end of the hour. Please follow the prompts at the bottom of the screen to email us your questions. And please also share your thoughts on social media using the hashtag IranWarCST and by tagging GUCST Public Life. So with that, let's get started. Let's begin with an opening question to each of you. Saurabh, I'd like to start with you. So a month and a half into this war, with church leaders speaking out with unity and clarity, what's your reaction to President Trump's remarks last night and Pope Leo's response? And what stands out for you about Pope Leo's leadership in this moment?
Well, thank you for having me, Kim, and thanks for convening this really urgent. I said on Twitter that I've not participated in a more urgent panel of this kind than this one. So obviously, in response to the president's long social media post about Pope Leo, and followed up with the since deleted image of himself, the president, as a sort of Christ-like figure healing someone. I was obviously appalled. I described it as demented on Twitter, and I use that word advisedly because, look, no one expects a president to carry the same message as a pope. No one expects a president to be a spiritual leader. That's all well and good. But nevertheless, it is unprecedented. Popes and presidents have had disagreements before, and yet you don't have a situation in which, in the past, where a president is describing and talking about the vicar of Christ, as Catholics view the Pope to be, and a spiritual leader of some 1.5 billion people, talking about him as a sort of fellow politician whom he's going to put down. And there's something odd about the fact, especially it opens up by saying Pope Leo is weak on crime. And that to me suggests that the president is in a stage of mental strain where he has a sort of grab bag of insults, where he might say, Ed Koch from the 80s, he was weak on crime. Barack Obama, Barack Hussein, Pope Leo, weak on, and they're all kind of blending together the targets of his animosity. So it brings me to your deeper question, what I think about Pope Leo's leadership. Look, we have to ask why the president has gotten to the point where late at night he's posting long rants about the successor of St. Peter, and images of AI slop images of himself as kind of almost like a Christ-like figure. And the reason for that is precisely because this administration has not heeded the voice of Pope Leo about this war, which is not just a matter of the morality of this war. Ultimately, this is a futile war that has led to the president being cornered. You cannot bomb a country into submission over however long you want to go. We tried that in Vietnam and it failed, and the same logic is here. And so out of that frustration with the fact that the Iranian government has the United States in a vice grip over the Strait of Hormuz, he's lashing out. He's lashing out as whoever might disagree with him, even if that person's the Pope. So it's not just a matter of a moral disconnect, but a strategic one as well. And it's the Pope who has the upper hand, I believe.
Thank you for that, Saurabh. I appreciate it. Mary Ellen, let's go to you. What's your reaction to what President Trump's remarks last night and Pope Leo's response, and what stands out to you about Pope Leo's leadership?
The first thing is the contrast between the two men. Pope Leo has spoken with calm, with diplomacy, with consideration for the human dignity that all people should enjoy, including President Trump. Pope Leo has an absolute duty to correct moral falsehoods when they are uttered, especially moral falsehoods of the level of invading a country without legal right to do so, of threatening to wipe out an entire people, that is to commit genocide, to have no concern about the killing of civilians and cutting off their very basic needs for survival, including water and food. So Pope Leo would rather be focused on other things, on making sure that we deal with the coming challenges of artificial intelligence, with poverty, with migration. But he has stepped into this moment and he is leading as he must do. It is, and Pope Leo, let me be very clear, and I'll be able to speak to this more in a few moments. He is not speaking from a position of his own personal preferences. It's not that he's just a meek and humble man who doesn't like war. The words he uses, the bases on which he is speaking these moral truths, in contrast to the falsehoods that he's countering, are all based on international law. This is the law of the entire international community. It is not the law of religious people or just Pope Leo. It is the law of every country in the world. And until President Trump began to say that he doesn't need international law, no president of the United States has ever disassociated himself with the rules of the international community that govern everything, not just war and peace, but trade, borders, air travel, anything you can think of. But most importantly for us as Catholics, it is the basis on which we speak in the common language of the world about peace and about human dignity and about care and concern for our common home, the environment. So Pope Leo does not want to have to be in this debate. He knows he must be. He is speaking truth to power, but a very strange kind of power. Power not based on the consensus of the world.
Speaking truth to power. Thank you for that, Mary Ellen. Betta, let's go to you. What is your reaction to President Trump's remarks last night and Pope Leo's response? What stands out to you about Pope Leo's leadership in this moment?
Yes, hello. Thank you for the invitation. First of all, here in Rome, we woke up with this big news because it was, for us, was in the night. And so the first thing to add of what Sohrab and Mary said before, I would say that I think Trump chose the worst moment he could never choose, because after what he said, Pope Leo was greeted by 70 journalists in the plane that was taking him to Argelia. And so even that he said very clear, I don't want to debate, I don't want to enter in a debate. Of course, the journalist asked the question. And he had to say, first of all, I'm not a political. He chose the worst moment because Trump had immediately the reply on TV of this post that was, I think, unbelievable. I think it's a sign of desperation, of weaknesses, the reaction that we had all over the world, but also here in Italy, for instance. Giorgia Meloni, the prime minister, she's an ally of Trump. She's conservative like Trump. She has the same vision, and she came out and said, this is unacceptable to speak about in this way. And plus, I would say there are lies in this post. One of the lies, Pope Leo was elected. Sorry, I am an expert. I wrote the book about the election of Pope Leo. Trump says that the Pope Leo was elected thanks to him because he was in the White House. That is totally, absolutely a lie. For him to be American was a weak point because nobody wanted to elect an American. And with these 2 points, the lie and I think a sign of desperation, I will stop here. Thank you.
Thanks very much for that, Betta. I appreciate it. Phil, let's go to you. We've heard about duty. We've heard about leadership. We've heard about sort of the Pope not being a politician. And yet, as Sohrab said, there's strategic implications here for what we're hearing. What do you think? What's your response to what happened over the weekend? And what does it tell you about Pope Leo's leadership?
I mean, of course, the post is deranged. It's very, especially the image of him as Jesus healing people. But you know, there's this way in which it gets kind of processed in American kind of partisan media as this dispute, as if between politicians, which other people have mentioned before. You know, I know famed biblical scholars like Sean Hannity have suggested that Pope Leo hasn't read the Bible and doesn't know what's in it. But you know, I'm going to go with the Pope on this one. And actually, the thing about it is, it's not as I think it was Mary mentioned before. It's not this, you know, dispute between personalities. Pope Leo is speaking from a very well-established tradition in terms of just war theory, in which this isn't really a hard case, right? And, you know, I know that like the demands of traditional just war theory are fairly strict. And if you explain them to people, the different components, they'll usually agree that they make sense. But whenever there's an actual military action happens, we all suddenly become fairly crude utilitarians, right? Trump spends special operations troops to Venezuela, and we think, what if it works? Or, and but by what we tend to mean is, what if it doesn't immediately turn into a disaster? What if it wins the news cycle? What if it doesn't tank approval ratings, right? And then the sort of long-term consequences of this we don't think about. And church teaching has never been utilitarian, right? And certainly not in that crude, you know, uh, immediate cycle way. And so, you know, when a lot of the conversation around this is about how feasible, successful, or at least not completely disastrous exit ramp from this war is, for myself, you know, I'm looking at a war where, you know, the Catholic thought tells you you need to have both a clear, just cause and a clear and achievable, just objective, and the strategy needs to be developed around that. We have never had either of those articulated. I mean, we've had every single rationale that you possibly could from, you know, Iran's nuclear program, their long-term threat, or maybe because the Israelis were going to strike, or because Iran was weak and this was our time. And the goals have been all over the place, from maximalist aims like regime change to, you know, minimal military objectives. And now it seems to be just trying to get the Strait of Hormuz open, right? And so this is obviously doesn't fit into that framework, right? And so it just sort of very straightforwardly, the Pope needs to insist upon really timeless Catholic principles, and be a voice of sort of slow and steady moral suasion, you know, which is, I think, ultimately really important determinative, right? We think in these short time frames, but when there's a dispute like this, I always think of supposedly Stalin said when he was advised of the Vatican's attitude on European problems, he said, and how many divisions does the Pope have, right? Which is as clear a articulation of the worship of hard power over moral suasion, right? Well, it's a century later. Stalin's ideological project is in ruins, and the church is still troubling the powerful. And I think that it's important for the church, but also as Americans, if we want our civilization to survive, we need to stop chasing ephemeral wins and recommit ourselves to more stringent moral values. And that is what the Pope is articulating.
Thank you so much. That's a great way to end our initial part of our conversation. And now we're going to move into a conversation with each one of you, a little bit more sustained level. And Sarab, I'll start again with you. Phil just told us about kind of looking long term, looking beyond the immediate. I just want to say that you were born in Tehran, you've moved to the United States in your early teens, and you're part of that Iranian diaspora, and you've written extensively about Iran. So I'd love for you to help us understand the history, the complex dynamics behind this conflict. As I mentioned earlier, Iran has obviously long supported brutal and destabilizing terrorism. Its nuclear ambitions have been deeply alarming for decades. And at the same time, I know that the history here is much more complicated than the current moment might suggest. So, what do people need to understand about how we arrived at this war and what's being missed in this public conversation?
Yeah, it's a tough question because you're talking about you know, whenever you talk about Iran, immediately your Iranian interlocutor will say, well, you know, in 2,500 years ago, Alexander the Great, you know, the Achaemenid dynasty. So it's hard to compress, but here's what I would highlight for our purposes. First of all, is that the Iranian regime, the Islamic Republic, was born out of a middle class uprising. My own family, most of my own immediate family supported it, even though lots of our broader family had misgivings because they were connected to the Shah's regime. My own family came from a kind of left nationalist background and thought that in supporting the Ayatollah Khomeini's revolution, they were going to get more democracy, more freedom than they had been enjoying under the former regime, the Shah. In fact, of course, they were almost immediately disabused of that in the worst way as the Ayatollah Khomeini instituted his theocracy. And part of one aspect of that theocracy was an anti-American, anti-Western ideology. There was some legitimate grievances that tapped into, but there were also kind of irrational elements that were part of that. However, over time, the kind of thinking that had informed Washington in dealing with regimes of this kind evolved. We tried regime change in the post 9/11 years, the regime change wars for 2 decades. I supported some of them, many of them. I was, as you mentioned, I worked at the Wall Street Journal editorial page, which is very hawkish, and hasn't had, my former colleagues never saw a war they didn't support. But the outcomes were terrible for those people and ultimately for the United States. In Iraq, ultimately it meant Iranian hegemony in Iraq because of the Shiite majority. In Afghanistan, the Taliban was deposed only to retake the country 20 years later. Syria descended into barbarous sort of violence and statelessness. And then ultimately you have essentially a former Al-Qaeda leader becoming the president of the country. Libya is still a problem for Europe. It's failed state. It still radiates instability and migrants and so on. So, as an American, as an Iranian, in some part of my head, I think, well, wouldn't it be so bad if this regime went away? But it's only as an American, having watched the failure of these enterprises, that I think I've been against these kinds of wars now. We were supposed to have been chastened by the experiences of those. And the fact is that you cannot kill a civilization. And in Iran, quite apart from the Islamic Republic of Iran, is a civilizational state. So not only is it appalling that the president threatened to wipe out an entire civilization, not only is it genocidal, and the contrast there is a Catholic Church that reminds us that it's a citadel of civilization, of rationality. This institution that so many people think is, it's pre-modern and it has one foot in the medieval world and so on, actually, is unbending when it comes to basic questions of morality and war. But be that as it may, the morality aside, it's futile. And so there are certain things that no Iranian system, whether it's the mullahs or whoever, will accede to. And it's that futility that I think should bother us as Americans.
Well, thanks for that. And you've talked a little, I love the perspective as someone from an Iranian background, as an American. Now I'd love to talk to you as a Catholic. You were a supporter of the Trump administration who's become a critic, particularly of this war, and your thinking has really been shaped by Catholic social teaching and the just war tradition. There are some Catholics who have supported this war, arguing that Iran's decades of sponsoring terrorism, its nuclear ambitions, are the kind of threat that just war teachings are designed to address. So how do you engage that argument from within the Catholic tradition that you share? And for those who are genuinely wrestling with this question and taking that threat and that tradition seriously, what would you want them to consider?
Yeah, I would highlight the question that Phil raised, or the set of questions that Phil raised in his remarks, which is there are a series of questions you have to ask before you then launch a war. It's not, we have to be realistic and acknowledge, yes, Iran has a history of supporting proxies that have committed heinous acts. The Beirut barracks bombing of 1983 comes to mind, and others of the kind. But the question we have to ask is, what is the objective? What is the cause? What is the objective? And are the means selected even going to achieve the objective in question? Merely lashing out in revenge, which is one of the arguments that have been thrown up, for 47 years of Iranian acts that we disapprove of and should and can disapprove of is not reason to then bomb a country relative to goals that we can't even articulate. Is it regime change? Well, that didn't happen. The Iranian regime actually hardened its position in some ways after a period when it was very unpopular. It's now reconsolidating its social base. Is it degrading Iranian military capacity? Okay, well, what does that achieve over time, given the fact that at some point the pressure that they can put on the United States economically will mean that we'll back away and they can just rebuild everything? Is it because the Israelis were about to attack, therefore we might as well go in? Well, what isn't the easier answer to that to restrain the Israelis as our client? So the fact that the goals have shifted so often in this manner should tell you that the cause and objective requirements, which demand reasonable explanations for why before leaders go to war, have not been met. So that's where I would leave it.
Thanks for that. Thank you very much. And Mary Ellen, that's a great way to go to you. You are our expert on the church's teaching around war and peace, on international law governing warfare in particular. So help us understand a little bit more about Catholic just war teaching and how it applies to this conflict, both with the initial decision to bomb Iran and with the way the bombing has been carried out. And I also want to just note that Pope Francis has worked to move the church towards a more active and demanding vision of peacemaking. Pope Leo's also called us to work for a disarming peace. So how do you think about these Catholic teachings on war and peace as a framework for evaluating the decisions we've described?
Well, let me take a step back a little bit, also maybe start where Sohrab did in ancient times. And it's absolutely clear that the church's teaching today on just war, as we still call it, even though Pope Francis taught us that there are no just wars, and he's absolutely right. But the origins of our understanding within the Catholic Church of the lawful or the moral resort to war mirrors or has same origins as international laws, principles governing the use of force. The law that we still use the old Latin name in international law, the jus ad bellum, the law to war. And it is a very parallel, it's a very similar set of principles. If you observe the law against using force, you will be acting consistently with the church's teaching on the use of force. So today, and that's why Pope Leo regularly references international law, and why I assume President Trump has made this first ever statement denigrating international law, rejecting it, because he does not want to be constrained. He does not feel that he is someone who should be constrained by legal or moral principles, as he's told New York Times reporters. So the basic teaching of the church, the United Nations Charter, which codifies this ancient law, this jus ad bellum, the core principles are in the United Nations Charter. But in addition, we've had numerous decisions of the International Court of Justice, the leading judicial body in the world, the Court of the United Nations, including in cases between the United States and Iran over attacks by the United States on Iran in the 1980s in the Iran-Iraq War. And from those two sources, the Charter and the decisions of the International Court of Justice, it's clear that that all war is prohibited in the first instance. There are only two limitations in the UN Charter on that resort to war. One is for self-defense if an armed attack occurs. That's Article 51. And otherwise, you need Security Council authorization, which in the current chaos, we're not going to get. So all it focuses on, and actually that mirrors the Catechism of the Catholic Church, which really focuses only on a right of self-defense. Well, the Charter makes it clear that self-defense really means what you need to do, the necessity, the urgency, the exigency in the moment of being attacked to defend yourself. Then the Charter goes on, and Catholic social teaching, and Pope Leo has emphasized in particular, and you, Kim, have spoken to how Pope Francis has really moved the church to this. For every other problem that a country faces, We have the art of diplomacy. We have peacemaking. We have incredible tools, including the International Court of Justice, including the treaty. So if the big concern is nuclear weapons, we had a successful negotiation in 2015. I think that the criticism of that through various political groups in the United States is unfounded. It was working. All the evidence shows that it was. Of course, it could continue to be improved. What about the militant organizations that Iran supports? Well, those are there are ways to resolve terrorism that has been far more successful. So regime change, it didn't happen. Another unlawful reason for using military force.
Thank you for that. And let's talk a little bit more about international law. You are one of over 100 international law experts who publicly concluded that the U.S. strikes on Iran violated the charter and that the conduct of war raises serious questions about potential war crimes. The letter that you co-signed describes not just specific wrongful acts, but more importantly, a systematic dismantling of civilian harm protections within the Defense Department. And at the same time, as we've said, the president has said that he doesn't need international law. So I'd love to focus on this, the moral significance of the institutional dismantling, not just the individual bad acts, but deliberate removal of structures designed to prevent them. What happens when the international order, when the most powerful country in the world seems to be abandoning the rules that it helped to write?
We should really look at that question in the broader context of the Trump administration really rejecting law in general. I've had conversations around the world with why is the rule of law declining, not only internationally, but at home. I think a lot can be drawn to the fact that so many powerful leaders, every member of NATO, decided that war after the Cold War was the right tool for re-engineering societies, regardless of the law. And that thinking that you can use military force, it comes out of an ideology that's really antithetical to international law and morality, and that is political science realism that really promotes military superiority and showing that you're willing to use military force either for deterrence reasons in the nuclear field or whatever. It's that ideology that has so enamored American presidents and their NATO partners that they went to war in Iraq, that they went to war in Afghanistan, that they continued the war in Afghanistan, the whole global war on terror. It's all in violation of the law. So we see this decision that a president is so powerful he can undermine the law coming to a man like Donald Trump. He doesn't even pretend anymore. He doesn't even look to the thin veil that a President Obama or President Bush put over the law violations. He doesn't understand that when you say there's no law but me, you are really shaking all the bases for, as Pope Leo has said, peaceful coexistence. You're shaking the economy. You're shaking the environment. Really, great countries begin to fall when they move into that toward kind of attitude. When it comes to we learned this is one of the great tragedies of the current moment. We learned the value of complying with the law, both on resort to war and in the conduct of war during Vietnam. We lost that war. We spent so much money. We bombed secretly in Cambodia. We violated every rule. We didn't let our hands be tied, and yet we lost. And the morale and the moral injury to our fighting men and women, we still feel today. So what did we do? We instituted the Law of War program. That's when we got really much better training, JAG officers being assigned to units, and then Secretary Hegseth comes in and fires them all. So thank goodness for Pope Leo. We will be doing a lot of rebuilding in the next administration.
Thank you. Thank you very much for that. Now let's look to sort of getting closer to the ground on these questions. And Bet, I'm going to come to you. You are a war correspondent for La Nación. You also cover Italy and the Vatican and have reported on Pope Leo's response to the outbreak of war, as well as his broader message of peace. You returned earlier a few months ago from the reporting trip to the region. And what can you tell us from the ground? How has the war affected the average person trying to live in the Middle East, both in the immediate reality of wartime, but also in their sense of what the future holds?
Well, it's a difficult. Each time is more difficult to cover a war. I will say something that the first victim of a war is the truth. What I can tell you, Israel is a country that has been in war for the last decades, let's say. Now it's the real war. Of course, the people are fed up, but there is this narrative that, of course, when there is this war, the alarms to go down in the shelter, people are united. The narrative that we are under threat and we have to attack who are trying to kill us. But what I am really appalled is about, I have always been going and covering wars, Iraq, Afghanistan, all. You mentioned Kosovo, Second Intifada, Libya, Syria, etc. My interests have never been about the missile, but in the human suffering. And what I see now is that, we are speaking about numbers, and the numbers are human beings. And what for me is appalling is that, for instance, last week, when we were all hoping that there would have been a truce, in 10 minutes, more than 350 people in Lebanon were killed. And what is the difference between these 350 people in Lebanon? If they would have been Americans, if they would have been Israelis, we would have had a big coverage. So this thing that one life, if you're a Palestinian, your life doesn't worth a penny. If you are an Ukrainian, I've been in Ukraine. So one thing is this appalling thing, and we have to do autocritic also the media, because the media play this game, no? Also entering this game, because if you're American, Israel, also Italian or whatever, 300 people dead, it's something monstrous, it's enormous. But if you are a Palestinian or Lebanese, it doesn't matter if you are Syrian, if you are Iraqi. So this is one thing that I think is appalling. Then I also appalled how, well, Mary was saying, this violation, of course. A war is always the craziness of the war, was saying Pope Francis the other day. Pope Leo is crazy, a war, but there were some rules. Now we are seeing hospitals. I saw with my eyes in Ukraine, but also now we have seen hospitals, schools. So, and then, well, another thing that I can tell with my experience being there on the ground, there were times that when we had the vest with the thing pressed and the helmet pressed, we felt, well, no, we are sure. Well, it's not like that. There is an intimidation of the press. We have seen with our colleagues in Gaza, nobody speaks also about that, but more than 200 people killed in Gaza. The other day, a colleague in Lebanon. So also this intimidation of the press and of what you write, what you say, what you do in television, I think.
I think that's so important. I think a message of Pope Leo and Pope Francis before him has been to sort of keep our eyes on the human faces of those who suffer here. And I wonder if you could talk a little bit about other commonalities between Pope Leo and Pope Francis, right? What has resonated with you about Pope Leo's response? In what way is it the same as Pope Francis, or echoing what Pope Francis would say? And do you see anything new and distinctive now?
Well, of course, personally, I used to be a friend of Pope Francis. So all the times I was in Gaza, I was in Ukraine, he would phone me to see how I was. So in that personal view, but he was something really worried about wars, worried, interested in the Rohingya, in Gaza. He would phone every day to the parish of the Holy Family in Gaza. But of course, with the difference of style that, of course, we see between Francis and Leo, you can see that Leo is absolutely worried also about this war. We have seen all the Holy Week, all the thing you were remembering. But I would like to see something that he said March 16, receiving journalists from the TG2, that is the channel 2 of the Italian television, that I felt really, I felt identified, I will read, sorry, always, but especially in the dramatic circumstances of war, such as those we are currently experiencing, the media must guard against the risk of becoming propaganda. And the task of journalists in verifying the news so as not to become a mouthpiece for those in power becomes even more urgent and delicate. I would say essential. These are words of Pope Leo. And then just another thing, it's up to you to show the suffering that war always brings to the people, to show the face of war and to relate it through the eyes of the victims, so as not to transform it into a video game. That was, another of those message implicit to Trump. No, it is not easy in the few minutes of a news program and its in-depth segments, but this is the challenge. So I felt these words were really very important to understand how also for Pope Leo, beside the horror, the craziness of the war, how is important our work as journalists in a war.
Thank you for that. I think so much of what we hear from our tradition and certainly our Catholic leaders is that it's so important to keep the reality, the part of the truth of what's happening is the human face and the human stories that are happening on the ground. Phil, that's so much a part of what you do. You're a veteran who served in Iraq with the U.S. Marine Corps. You're an award-winning author, and you've spent your career trying to make the human reality of war tangible to those of us who have never experienced it. I've talked already, many of us have talked about the civilian casualties in Iran, the children who've been killed. We know similar numbers have been killed in Lebanon. At least 13 U.S. service members have been killed as well. Help us understand, of course, so many more in wars and conflicts around the globe and victims of terrorism and all the rest. Help us understand what it means to recognize with all of this news for a war, to reckon with the kind of news for a war fought in our name. And what
Yeah.
does Catholic teaching on the dignity of human life mean in this moment?
There's a statement that Pope Leo put out where he talks about the mission of the Christian soldier, which he describes as defending the weak, protecting peaceful coexistence, intervening in disasters, operating in international missions to preserve peace and restore order. And that is a ethic that is actually not so uncommon to many people who join the military, right? That one wants their service to be infused in some way with a kind of moral purpose. And this is a Catholic teaching, but it's also deeply resonant with a lot of American history in terms of how American presidents have conceived of the role of the soldier, right? Which applies not just to why we wage wars, but also our conduct during them. George Washington wanted his troops to justly secure the attachment of all good men. Lincoln struck a decidedly religious register, far from the kind of triumphal exultation in slaughter that you see from the Trump administration. And I think that that's actually deeply important for somebody for whom military service is a calling and a vocation, right? And so part of this is the kind of disaster that I see is a sort of degradation of America's moral standing, as well as a kind of all of this is dishonorable for the military itself, right? We have long prided ourselves on being a leader in international affairs and in sort of pushing towards more restraint in war. That has been something that we've been backsliding on, particularly, under Hegseth. He fired about 90% of the people whose job it was to try and avoid civilian casualties in CENTCOM prior to the strike that killed all of those girls at that school. And the administration openly brags about the lack of restraint with which they wage war, a lack of restraint which has not achieved the objectives that they promise. And the guiding ethic seems to be that of Stephen Miller when he said that we live in a world that's governed by strength, that's governed by force, that's governed by power. That is a pagan ethic. That is not a Christian ethic, right? It is about as antithetical to a Christian ethic as you possibly could have. And so I think that the appropriate response to a statement like that is moral and spiritual revulsion.
Thank you. Thank you very much for that. And I think that you talk about sort of a revulsion. I want to go to something that Beto was just talking about, right? When journalists sort of, or when it's portrayed to us as almost gamified or a video game. You've written quite a lot about this. The White House video reels that splice together actual footage of
Yep.
U.S. airstrikes that, killed actual people with clips from video games and this sort of triumphalist gamification of what's happening. You've written a lot about something even deeper than this, which is a problem of a society that wages what you call endless and invisible war. What does that invisibility do to democratic accountability? And is there anything in the Catholic tradition that places a moral burden on us as citizens, not just on those who are giving the orders?
Yeah. Until, you know, really gas prices go up, right? We've been able to wage wars for decades with very little impact on the American citizen, right? And we've had a political class, and this is not something that I simply lay at Trump. I think, I've long been a critic of a lot of the things that the Obama administration did here, um, in which we've been asked as citizens to not really pay attention to our wars or to not believe that they're actually wars if they're not costing us so much. So we may be ramping up a, massive campaign against ISIS, right? You know, Fighting ISIS would be a cause that I would support. Okay. But all the while telling Americans that it's not really a war and we're not actually putting boots on the ground. And yes, special operators sometimes end up in combat situations, but we're not sending people into combat and so on. Because we have this sort of schizophrenic public mood where we don't want endless wars, but we also want to see bad guys get punished. And the upshot of that, and I think the Trump administration is merely the sort of the apogee of this tendency, is where we're encouraged to sort of see the spectacle of striking whatever the identified bad guy is and exulting in a sort of display of power that gets disconnected from serious conversations about what that's actually achieving, right? I mean, the Venezuela boat strikes was the most obvious example of that. Not even hardcore, drug policy hawks would think that that was a policy was going to do anything in terms of drugs in the United States, but it did lead to an endless, display of sizzle reels of snuff films, right? And so I think that to have an administration that is actively encouraging us to see the exercise of violence as a kind of pleasurable media experience, right? Rather than the most morally serious thing that a nation can do, right? With the gravest possible risks, is a kind of moral education or maleducation for us as a citizenry. And I think I've written about, Augustine talking about a friend who went to the gladiator games and, seeing the delight of the crowd, and Augustine's phrase, he imbibed madness, right? And that madness struck him in the soul. And I think that that is what we are encouraged to do with these kind of videos, with these sort of bombastic press conferences. And so I think it is it's the culmination of a lot of political and military trends that are the result of our power, that are the result of new technologies, and frankly, the result of political dysfunction. But I think that the upshot is not simply is a sort of bad policy for the world and global security in the long term, and also I think a kind of grievous wounding of the national soul.
Thank you. Thank you very much for that. And thanks to you all for these comments, for your remarks. I'd love to go. We're going to move now towards questions from our audience watching online. We have a great deal of questions coming in, great number of questions coming in. And for those of you who are watching, please respond and please send in your questions with the directions at the bottom of your screen. So Rob, I'm going to start with you for the first one. This is a question from a Georgetown student. Do you see a potential off-ramp here? Do you see a potential solution to the animosity that we're seeing between people? But just practically, how might we look to end this conflict? What is the next step?
Yeah, so look, I think that there is no military solution to this conflict because for the Iranians, keeping the Strait of Hormuz closed is very easy. We've just recently, over the weekend, heard from obviously reported U.S. intelligence that they retain a lot more of their missiles than we thought, and what they retain are the ones that are more devastating. The drones are very cheap, and they have lots of them, so we can inflict lots and lots of pain on civilians, contra to the laws of war, contra to all human morality, completely unacceptable, as Pope Leo warned. But it wouldn't change the picture. They can hold the straight. They can continue to um, inflict pain on the United States. So there has to be some sort of negotiated settlement. It's painful, though, that the negotiated settlement might just be restoring a status quo ante that wouldn't have been disrupted but for President Trump's decision to join this Israeli operation against Iran. In other words, the realistic type of scenario that I'm seeing is a kind of non-agreement agreement. The U.S. kind of pulls away. The Iranians begin to strike bilateral deals for transit through the Strait of Hormuz, which lots and lots of countries depend on, and they get a toll, and that toll essentially serves as a kind of what they insist on, kind of reparations. Um, the other alternative is to get a big agreement, but that one requires the United States to not negotiate maximally, to not say no enrichment when they already have had enrichment capacity, or say no missiles when they've repeatedly been attacked, including twice during negotiations. So obviously they're going to keep their deterrent. So I don't think a negotiated settlement is possible unless the United States is willing to treat negotiations as negotiations, bargaining, rather than just imposition from on high. On the broader point, I'll just make one very quick point. I love Phil's remarks throughout. I would just make some slight distinction to say that not all pagan thought obviously views human beings as beasts. And I think what we need to reject is the kind of pseudo-realism of the Trumpians, which is like, this is how the world is. We blow stuff up, and go back to what's good in the pagans, which of course in the pagan philosophical anthropology exemplified by Aristotle, which the church has made its own, which is to say, no, human beings we're rational, we're political creatures, we can do things together. That kind of universalism and that richer view of what human nature is, rather than the base so-called realism of these kind of videos that they show trying to sort of inflict horror upon the Iranians or others.
Thanks for that. And Mary Ellen, I wonder if we could come to you first and then Phil on the same question, right? Your reaction to what you've just heard. And I want to fold another question that we're getting in there, which is, how do you think about new kinds of weapons, AI-assisted targeting in this world as well? So first, a reaction to what you've heard about kind of an off-ramp and resources that we might have prior to the Christian tradition. Also thinking about new kinds of weapons and looking forward.
Well, it's actually the same answer. It's the same problem, and I'm so grateful to Saurabh for going back to, there are universal truths, and it does not, it's not people's particular religious orientation. Law pre-exists most of the contemporary religions, and certainly Catholicism, and it emerges in human communities to give them an alternative, a peaceful alternative for keeping order from violence. And we have lost sight of that. We've gone back to thinking that violence is going to, and those who have greater military capacity have somehow an edge on everyone else. And this is resulting in this chaos and this loss of respect for and confidence in our legal institutions. It's all of a piece. So let me just say that it's really imperative, and I'm so grateful to Pope Leo to speak up about these enduring truths. My colleagues in international law have steadily allowed these leaders making their demands to use military force, especially when unmanned systems became available, and they could use force at quote unquote lower cost, certainly lower costs in terms of loss of US soldiers, but we've lost plenty of soldiers despite this. This is all quite mythical. But international lawyers have gone along with these demands because they don't have this enduring sense of the legal principles that are based on natural law, that endure through the generations that are reflected in fundamental moral teaching. And so those of us who have this access need to speak out more, as we are doing in this panel. And that is the basis on which we will bring new respect for law. And that is essential for governing technology going forward, because there's always this temptation to use the technology that we have and to believe in these, as Sorab calls it, pseudo-realist ideologies that press you to use your advantage in military force. But the thing with AI is we're moving increasingly toward autonomy. And if the algorithms are being fed from the internet now with large language models that have no concern for human life, that are constantly talking about preemptive force and getting the bad guys in this very strange binary between good and evil, and it's doing it on its own with autonomously, it is beyond a dark future. It is beyond the dark ages of what we're moving into. We have really a critical short time. I'm not going to predict how short, but it's time to act now and rebuild into everything we do, all the ways we think, into the internet, into the algorithms, that we respect human life, and peace and human dignity are the basis of why we exist together as human beings.
Thank you for that. And I want to emphasize that idea that this is a responsibility we all have to bring these moral principles to these public conversations as they move forward. Phil, I'd love to get your perspective on what you've heard from Sorab and Mary Ellen, as well as this idea of AI in warfare.
Oh, well, I just would say I wholeheartedly in agreement with Sohrab. So yeah, apologies to all the pagans in the audience. I was thinking more of the kind of rhetoric of the Roman emperors and Assyrian kings that a lot of Christian thinkers are who are developing just war theory, or sort of defining their ethic against, in terms of what the appropriate Christian relationship to war should be. I certainly think I think that AI, it only accentuates the problems that are already present, right? In terms of our ability to thoughtlessly exercise power at distance, but it doesn't change the fact that the human realities of war are the ones that are most essential, right? You have seen again and again and again that technological superiority in warfare, it can do a lot of things. It can do a lot of tremendously powerful things. But oftentimes what is long-term determinative are the second and third order consequences of the use of violence on populations, right? We learned that in Iraq, or well, we should have learned that in Iraq. We should have learned that in Afghanistan. We should have learned that in Libya. It's a lesson that we always need to be relearning. And with every new technology, the degree to which people thought that air power and mass bombing would reshape war, or rather would totally redefine the ability of a nation with air superiority to totally dominate its opposition, was something that was believed in the early part of the 20th century. And it's not that air power didn't reshape war. It did, but it never lived up to the promises that it did, because the individual human being always remains essential. And I think that is one of the things that the Catholic tradition insists on, no matter what the new technological, extension of the human is.
Thank you for that. Betta, I want to come to you with a question that we have coming in. What will we see from Pope Leo going forward, right? He's on this trip right now, he's in Algeria. He's on a 10-day trip through Africa. How do you see him sort of next steps responding to this conflict? What do you see in the next few weeks?
I see that he is, as he said in July in one of the first interviews, I'm learning to be a pope, that in all these months he's more, relaxed as pope, and he wasn't intimidated at all with the post of Trump. We have seen the first speech in Algeria. He insisted in the urgent need of to promote peace in this world, the dialogue. Then I've seen when he was in Turkey in one of his first trips, he has entered again and most so is following the path of Pope Francis with the interreligious dialogue in this moment that is essential. He went to the land of St. Augustine. He's an Augustinian, but it's also, a country of this African trip. Is the only country with a majority of Muslim. So he had paid respect. And this is very important in this moment. And last, for not least, I would say that he will keep speaking not just about against war, but about social justice, about about we have to receive well the migrants, so immigration. And by the way, he won't go for the 4th of July. He will go to Lampedusa, the island of Lampedusa, that is the symbol of the drama of the migration. And so I think that also it's a message. And that was, as you all know, the very first trip of Pope Francis. And that was a symbolic trip. And he will go, 13 years after. And I think that is good. So we will keep seeing a man that is a very tranquil, relaxed, another style, but is following the path of Pope Francis in all these essential questions, and in these moments, especially.
Thank you. And thanks to all of you for this wonderfully enriching conversation. I've learned a lot. I want to go around one more time and just ask each of you for one brief takeaway. If we were to have people watching out there think of one thing they should take away from our conversation, one thing they can do, what would it be? So, Rob, let's start with you. You're muted, sorry.
Just may Almighty God preserve Pope Leo for us.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Mary Ellen, how about yourself?
Yeah, I can't second that too strongly, but let's all pray for peace. Let's all pray for a new understanding of the limits of the use of war and the great alternatives to war that are drawing from our great tradition of morality and law in the Catholic Church.
Wonderful. Betta, how about yourself? What should we take away from our conversation?
I will say thank you for listening, and let's all listen, and listen especially the message of Pope Leo in this moment and after that post that we were all about of Trump. Thank you.
Thank you. Phil, one last takeaway.
I'd say that the church's role is not to win a news cycle or a social media slap fight, but to calmly articulate timeless truths which should inform our approach to war and to politics, but can never be reduced to our politics. I think that's what Pope Leo is doing, and I think we should listen and pray.
I can't think of a better way to end that. I can't think of a better way. It's not about winning a news cycle. It's about listening to timeless truths. It's about listening. It's about praying. Thank you to all of you for that and for what you've said today. I want to mention as we wrap up an upcoming Salt and Light gathering for young adults that we'll be hosting on the crisis of connection, strengthening faith and relationships, with Senior Fellow Christine Emba, with Mana Afsari, Christian Bentley, and Robert Christian coming up very soon. And more information on that will be at our site tomorrow, and we'll go out to all of you. This discussion will be recorded on our website. It'll be posted there. There's also lots of follow-up resources there if you'd like to learn more about what Pope Leo has been saying, what the U.S. bishops have been saying. Lots of really strong work there as well. What those of us here on the panel have been writing and saying. That'll be on our resources page. I want to thank everyone who's been involved in bringing this conversation to you today, including my wonderful colleagues, Kim Mazik, Chris White, Anna Gordon, Christian Sunan, and Blaine Bieni, and for our student fellows, Luke and Neil. Thanks all of you for joining us, and thank you. Please join me in thanking Suraba Mari, Mary Ellen O'Connell, Betta Piquet, and Phil Cly for being with us today.